we are in Sorbara. Sorbara is this very little town near Modena, about 20 kilometers far from Modena. Our focus is on Lambrusco Sorbara. At some point, late 90s, we decided to try this 100% Sorbara grape. And actually, we were the first ones to try to vinify Sorbara separately. Of course, we still have some Lambrusco Salamino because we need this grape variety to pollinate Sorbara. So, of course, we work with both, but let's say our main focus is on Sorbara alone.
Fascinating people with stories to share, fabulous wines and the best local foods to accompany them, and beautiful places to discover and visit. All of this and more on Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast. Join me for a new episode every Tuesday. Welcome to Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on Italian Wine Podcast. Today we travel to Emilia-Romagna, to the wine hills of Sorbara, not far from Modena, to meet my guest, Cecilia Paltrinieri of the Cantina Paltrinieri winery, which specializes in the production of a very special wine that I love, Lambrusco di Sorbara. Buongiorno, Cecilia. How are you today? Is it a beautiful day in Sorbara?
Hi, everyone. Yes, today is such a nice day, very sunny and warm. Yeah.
So spring has arrived.
It is arrived, yeah.
Okay, that's great. It's not yet arrived here in England. A little bit chilly here, but I think we're getting there. You are in Emilia-Romagna, one of the great food regions known and loved around the world. People may not know Sorbara so well, a small town and a wine that isn't as widely known as it deserves to be. So before we talk about your family and about the wine, can you describe where you are, what the country's like, what the countryside looks like, so our listeners who are located all around the world can get a good visual impression of where you are?
Yeah. Again, we are in Sorbara. Sorbara is this very little town near Modena, about 20 kilometers far from Modena. We live in a very wide plain, this is called Pianura Padana. So everything is pretty much very, very flat. We see the mountains, but they're very far from where we are. Actually, Sorbara is basically the narrowest point of land between the two rivers that flow in Modena. So, the territory that we have is, of course, very humid. And well, we are lucky because our soil is very rich in water and minerals, of course, too. But yeah, so we are in a, let's say, very like wide countryside. Yeah, that's where we are.
Okay, well, that's great. And your family have been producing wine for 4 generations, is that right? Can you share your family story?
Yeah, so I am the fourth generation. Everything started with my great grandpa in the 20s. He actually was a chemist, the first person in my family to ever go to university. We're talking about late 1800s, so going to university was like a huge deal. That probably meant that his family had quite a little bit of money. So having some money, they invested it in the land. So they started to buy some land to plant vineyards, of course. And they started to make wine really as a family tradition. So he would make wine with his kids. He had 5 kids. My grandpa was the youngest. And by the time that my grandpa grew up, let's say he realized that he wanted to make wine. Of course, times had really changed compared to what my great grandpa was facing. So basically, in the 60s, he decided to marry my grandma. They stayed in Sorbara to live, and basically, he inherited the small winery that his dad had built, and of course, some of the land. So in the 60s, this, let's say, it becomes a full-time job. And then my parents then took over in late 90s. My dad graduated from university, I think, in 1996. So that was the first, let's say, official harvest that he did in the winery. And then my mom joined a couple of years later. And then I started to work here about a couple of years ago. Yeah.
Okay, so it's four generations now in this small town of Sorbara and cultivating a quite unique grape variety. Now, many people around the world will be familiar perhaps with Lambrusco, with various styles of Lambrusco and various colors of Lambrusco wine, but they may not have come across a Lambrusco di Sorbara, which is quite a unique grape variety. Can you tell us first, before we talk about the wines, let's just talk about this grape variety, Lambrusco di Sorbara.
Yeah, everyone is pretty familiar with Lambrusco in general, like you said. What people not very often maybe realize is that Lambrusco is such a wide family of different grape varieties, you know. So I think it's definitely more interesting and better in general to then go deeper and like specify a particular grape variety that we're talking about, you know. So what we like to say here is actually using this metaphor by which Lambrusco would kind of be, you know, the family name, the last name for a family, okay? A family with like many, many kids. So if you just go by Lambrusco, of course, you're not saying much, okay? You're not identifying someone in particular, okay? So this is our way of saying that it's definitely more interesting to go deeper in this type of conversation, okay? And more specifically, because again, what people are usually familiar with is a type of Lambrusco that is usually very dark and maybe even a little bit sweet. What we do is actually quite the opposite. So Sorbara is instead very, very light and very acidic, very dry. So going back to this metaphor of the family, you know, what we like to say is that Sorbara is kind of like the, you know, the weird kid, like red-headed, blue eyes, and everyone else is like dark hair and brown eyes. This is because Sorbara is really, in this family, it really stands out for his unique color and very high acidity. These are the two main characteristics for this grape. The color for this wine is really given by, of course, the color of the grape. Okay, so we're talking about a grape for which the berry has a very thin skin and very light per se. So of course, when we press the grapes to get the juice, we don't really get much color. Okay. And then the second characteristic, this very strong acidity, actually comes from a pollination problem that this grape has. So but we're basically talking about grape variety that is not able to self-pollinate. So basically the result is that not all of the berries in the single bunch mature all of the way up, okay? So you will have some berries that will mature because they will have the seed inside, but then you will have so many more berries that will be little because they will not ripe, they will not mature, okay? So of course, when we harvest, it's not like you can really separate, you know, the mature berries from the not so matured ones. So of course we collect everything together and the result is a very strong acidity in the juice and then in the wine too, of course.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. And I think it's very important for our listeners to understand exactly what you said, that Lambrusco is a family of grape varieties. There are many types, the Grasparosa, Maestra,
Salamino.
many, many different, and as you say, many different colors from the deepest reds that are almost a black to the very pale Lambrusco di Sorbara. Very interesting what you were saying about the self-pollination, Cecilia. Lambrusco di Sorbara is almost like a wild grapevine, isn't it? And it needs to have some assistance with that pollination. Aren't other vines sometimes planted nearby to help assist with the pollination?
Yeah, so traditionally, what people have found that helps a little bit with this situation for Sorbara being so acidic because of the pollination problem is to also plant another grape variety, which is still part of the whole Lambrusco family, which just by the fact that it would be planted right next to Sorbara, it would then help with the pollination. So this other grape variety is called Salamino. The full name would be Lambrusco Salamino. And it's really a DOC in terms of the area for Modena. It's a DOC very close to the area where Sorbara DOC is also produced. So Salamino is basically functions as a pollinator for Sorbara. Of course, Salamino is actually quite the opposite compared to the Sorbara grape. So we're talking about a grape variety that is naturally much darker and much like fruiter and not as acidic as Sorbara. This because the skin is much thicker, so and just darker per se. So the natural color is darker. And as far as the acidity is concerned, basically this other grape variety is not really affected by this pollination problem that instead Sorbara faces. So into the wine, it does not really translate into such high acidities.
Okay, that's really interesting as well. So we're really getting an idea of, as is the case throughout Italy, but how local these different varieties of Lambrusco are. And Sobara really grown in a very small area within Modena vineyards, and Salamino similarly, as are the other varieties. So I think people can begin to get an idea of distinguishing between the various Lambruscos. I think it's very interesting that your family specialize just in one variety of Lambrusco, Lambrusco di Sorbara, but yet are still able to make a full range of wines. Can we just dive into some of the wines that you produce? And I'd like to begin with your Grosso Metodo Classico.
Yeah. So as you said, of course, our focus is on Lambrusco Sorbara, and actually, our family as a winery, we were the first ones to try to vinify Sorbara separately, and that is because, as I told you, Salamino works as a pollinator for Sorbara, right? So of course, it is planted right next to Sorbara, and actually, up to 20, 25 years ago, the standard was to plant these two grape varieties even in the same rows. So, of course, the easiest way to then collect during harvest was to just collect everything. So, the standard product around this area was a natural blend of these two grapes. So, at some point, late 90s, we decided to try this 100% Sorbara grape path. Of course, we still have some Lambrusco vines because we need to have this grape variety to pollinate Sorbara. So, of course, we work with both, but let's say our main focus is on Sorbara alone. You mentioned Grosso. Grosso is our first metodo classico, so champenoise style. Grosso is 100% Sorbara grape, and as a metodo classico, basically we usually wait from 30 to 36 months before taking away the yeast, so in the bottle, and then so for example, we are selling Grosso Vintage 2021, degorged last summer, so in July 2024. Okay, so almost 3 years on the lease in the bottle. Grosso is our first spumante wines, Metodo Classico. And I think it was one of our ways of try to explain to people that this very strong acidity that really characterizes Sorbara. This is really what allows us to, I'd say, to experiment in time, to do such long fermentations, long aging into the bottle. And I think this is really what we like about Lambrusco di Sorbara, this very strong acidity.
Okay, and what does making a metodo classico Lambrusco di Sorbara, what does that process give to the finished wine? Because I know you also make a Martinotti, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Yeah, I think it just gives so much complexity. The wine sets on the lees for 3 years. So you have all of that complexity given by the yeasts and this very long aging process. But then the yeast is taken away. So you still have a very smooth type of wine and very elegant too, I'd say. Of course, then the bubbles are very fine as being a spumante wine, and yeah, fine and elegant, of course.
Okay, so a completely different wine then would be your Radice, which is fermented in the bottle as well,
Yeah,
but not by the metodo classico.
exactly. Radice is a bottle fermented wine. So basically, the first fermentation happens in the stainless steel tanks. And then we try to have a unique bottling session around March. each year to bottle Radice before the second fermentation happens, so that the second fermentation entirely happens inside the bottle. Of course, once the wine is bottled, we don't really have any way of controlling the temperature there. And so any way of controlling the whole fermentation process, actually. So the second fermentation, so the one that gives the bubbles eventually, that will just happen in a very spontaneous and natural way inside the bottle as the temperatures outside rise, basically.
Okay, so it's more of a pet nat style, would we say?
Exactly. Yeah. So then the yeast remains inside the bottle once the fermentation is done, and we just sell it like this. So it's a cloudy, non-filtered type of wine.
Okay, so very different for that to the elegant grosso, the metodo classico. But also your name is Radice, so this goes back to the family roots, to how wine was made by your great grandfather and perhaps your grandfather.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, Radice for two reasons. I don't know if you remember the label for this wine, but it's an old map of where we are.
Hmm.
It was our way of saying, our roots are here. Okay, in the label you can actually recognize where the winery is, a way of saying we've been here for quite some time. And then the
Okay.
second reason is what you were saying, so really the tradition for this method. So of course, when my great grandpa and when my grandpa too, when they were making wine, stainless steel was not much of a big thing as it is today, right? So they would use concrete actually, but just for the first fermentation. So they would let the wine ferment for the first fermentation, so for the alcoholic fermentation in cement, and then they would bottle everything right away, just letting the second fermentation happen spontaneously during summer and spring. So, it's fun because sometimes I have people coming to the winery and asking me, there is much like of a trend for like these natural wines nowadays, Patinat style. So when is it that you started making your own natural wine, right? And what we what we like to say is that we actually never really stopped, because this method was really it's really the most traditional method to get the bubbles in our area, in not just in our area, everywhere you make bubbly wines actually.
Okay, that's really important. I think that's a very good explanation of the history of Lambrusco in your area and also of the family root. Another wine I'd like to hear about, and I'd even more like to taste it, is l'Eclisse.
Yeah, L'Eclisse is 100% Sorbara, just like Grosso and just like Radice, actually. L'Eclisse is a long Sharma method. So I told you, nowadays, again, stainless steel is what is been used most of the times. So of course, we use Sharma methods for some of our wines, Martinotti style. L'Eclisse is one of those. Instead of doing actually a standard Martinotti method, L'Eclisse is actually a bit longer, does a little bit of a longer fermentation because it stays in the tank in the autoclave for about 4 to 5 months. So it's a bit of a longer fermentation, and this, of course, means that the bubbles get, finer, more elegant, more persistent, generally speaking. So this, I think, has a little bit more of a structure to this wine, a more of a complex type of structure of body for this wine. And also, l'Eclisse is a cru, so we only use one specific parcel for this wine.
Okay, so there's a more concentrated character of the Lambrusco di Sorbara coming from the cru, the single vineyard, but also from this lengthy period of secondary fermentation in the tank, Charmat or Martinotti method.
Yeah.
I was interested to see on your website that we're talking about one grape variety, Lambrusco di Sorbara, this pale variety of Lambrusco, making wines generally so much paler in color than the dense and deeper colors of some Lambruschi. But even within that, you have quite a range of colors yourself between your wine. There's
Yeah.
quite a palette of colors. Is that through a greater extract when you're vinifying, or does it vary from year to year?
It does vary from year to year, that of course. Then I think what really plays a significant role here is specifically the second fermentation. So talking about the wines that we explored earlier, we summarize all of our, let's say, the methods that we use for the second fermentation. So the Martinotti style, bottle fermented, and metodo classico, right? So I think this second fermentation really is the one that plays a significant role. Just to give you an idea, the Charmat method wines that we make six of them, but four of them undergo a standard Martinotti method fermentation, so a couple of months in the tank. Then I told you about L'Eclisse that does instead from 4 to 5 months, and then we also have La Riserva, which is 12 months. So of course, with a longer fermentation, the color actually even decreases a little bit more, and of course, the bubbles are affected too.
Okay, okay. Well, that's a very good point. These three very distinctive ways of doing the secondary fermentation. Now, I know you produce more wines, quite a range, but I'd like to turn now to food because you are in one of the great food areas of Italy. Sorbara, of course, is just outside of Modena, which is a city of fast cars and slow food. We're in an area with some of the greatest and most outstanding food products that are known around the world. The food of your area is really made to be enjoyed with wines like Lambrusco di Sorbara, isn't it? Can you tell us about some of the foods that are really typical that every visitor that comes to Modena and to Sorbara should definitely try to taste and how they pair with your wines?
Yeah, well, this area is food wise, okay, it's very known for usually very greasy type of food, very fatty.
The salumi.
Yeah, anything related to cold meats, but then also gnocco fritto, if you
Oh,
know
yes.
that. Yeah. So of course, this type of food pairs very, very well to Lambrusco, and especially Lambrusco di Sorbara. I say especially Lambrusco di Sorbara because given the super strong acidity that this wine has, that this grape variety has, this is really something that helps the mouth to be cleaned up when you eat something so fatty and so greasy again. So anything that has a little bit of greasiness would be super good with our wines. And actually, going a little bit farther from our region, I think these wines are very versatile, really because of this strong acidity that they have. We were quite surprised when we started to export. We were quite surprised to see that one of our biggest market is Canada, where fish consumption is pretty high, and that is really because well, the color of our wines definitely helps here. Okay, they're very light, so generally speaking, fish is paired with white wines, and our wines are very pale. But again, a very fatty fish, just like a tuna or salmon, they pair very well with our wines too, with Lambrusco di Sorbara in general.
Okay, that's really interesting, and it is important to appreciate acidity and how it helps to really helps to pair. I'm thinking about that gnocco fritto.
Yeah,
It's a pasta dough that's deep fried. Is that right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then you would maybe have a slice of prosciutto di Modena or di
Mhm.
Parma with that, or some
Yeah.
culatello. So something to eat with your hands, and then have a glass of Lambrusco di Sorbara with. You also produce a very special product that is, again, very linked to Modena, also from grapes. Can you tell us about your acetaia?
Yeah, we do have a small production for balsamic. For us, this really is kind of a niche production and product in general. So we only make the very aged one. The production for our balsamic started 60 years ago or so with my grandpa, and we never stopped ever since. So what we make is basically a almost a 60 years aged balsamic vinegar. So the full name would be aceto balsamico tradizionale extra vecchio because it is aged more than 25 years. And yeah, it's basically it's my grandma taking care of this actually. I wish I could someday be as good as her in taking care of our balsamic. Of course, balsamic is a product starting from must, so from juice, so not really from wine.
What grape varieties would you use for your aceto balsamico tradizionale?
The tradition would be to use white grapes, and in our region, the most common one would be Trebbiano Modenese, which is again a white grape variety. And the reason why you would use this grape variety, well, white grape varieties in general, is that our region is known for wine, but mostly for red wine, right? So when people had some white grapes, they wouldn't use it for wine because they thought of it as kind of a second hand sort of grape variety. So instead, they would use that for balsamic, which being so aged, you cannot really tell, especially if you go very long with the aging of that product, you cannot really tell this the starting point, okay? Because every year it just concentrates so much, it becomes so thick, so it doesn't really matter that much which grape variety you are starting with.
Okay, so this is the grape must, which you then cook.
Exactly. Yeah, you boil it. It's kind of like a Solera method for wine, meaning that balsamic is basically non-vintage type of product. So every year, fill again those little wooden barrels within which you still have some balsamic, but it evaporates during summer. So the portion that is missing, you use the previous vintage to top that off.
Okay, starting with bigger barrels for the,
Yeah.
and then moving through different woods of smaller sizes.
Yeah.
Okay, and I just want our listeners to be absolutely clear that this aceto balsamico tradizionale stravecchio, this very old aceto balsamico, is nothing to do with the industrially produced aceto balsamico di Modena, which is found around the world and which is very confusing because this is made simply and only from cooked grape must. Is that right?
Yeah, it is right. Yeah.
So it's something very, very special, something very rare, and something that must be tasted. What is the best way to taste your aceto balsamico tradizionale stravecchio?
So one of the best ways would be on Parmigiano,
Okay.
actually, and especially the one that is a bit aged. So I would go with a 36 months of aging or even more if possible. One other way that I like to suggest is on ice cream. And that is because ice cream is so cold, that it doesn't really modify anything for balsamic in terms of the consistency, the texture, the flavors. So if you really want to taste balsamic, the best would be on something that is cold. And that is actually,
Oh,
yeah, it's actually the reason as to why if you go to like a balsamic tasting, most often they would serve it on ceramic spoons because ceramics is it maintains the cold.
okay. Okay. So this is something we're talking about. You sample, it's very, very precious. It's very expensive. You sample it drop by drop, and it is really exquisite and a real treat to be able to experience it. And Cecilia, our listeners who will be very anxious now and keen to taste Lambrusco di Sorbara and also Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale, can they visit you and what do you offer for hospitality?
Yeah, of course they can visit us. We'd be super happy to have them. We offer tours every day from Monday to Saturday in the morning and in the afternoon. We offer wine tours. So basically, you have the possibility of touring the whole winery, so every process. Of course, also the vineyard if the weather allows it. But yeah, inside every aspect of the vinification, the packaging, really everything. And then, of course, if people want to see it, we also let them see our acetaia, so where we make our balsamic, and then we have the tasting of our wines and of course the balsamic too.
Okay, that sounds great. That sounds like a comprehensive. And is it possible to have some of those fatty foods, that salumi or foods like that with the tasting?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's a must, isn't it? Yeah. Well, it sounds fabulous. Cecilia, it's been a real pleasure meeting you this morning, talking about Lambrusco di Sorbara, learning about it, because as I say, it's a Lambrusco that many listeners won't have sampled. This pale, delightful, quite gastronomic Lambrusco, very dry with this backbone of acidity that makes it such a great food wine. And you've really explained that story well, and also these different ways of secondary fermentation, of the metodo classico, the secondary fermentation in the bottle, the pet nat style, and then of course the Martinotti method. So three very different ways to get different results, but all from the same grape variety. So thank you very much for sharing your story, your family story with us, and for being my guest.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Good. Well, I hope to meet and I look forward to tasting your wines with you.
Thank
Grazie.
you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Buona giornata. We hope today's episode of Wine, Food and Travel with me, Marc Millon, on the Italian Wine Podcast has transported you to somewhere special. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your pods. Likewise, you can visit us at ItalianWinePodcast.com. Until next time, chin chin.